Hello everyone, I'm Joshua. I'm here to talk to you about designing an ambiguity. So a little bit about me first before I get into it. I have had a lot of experience designing an ambiguity. I started off my career about 8 years ago in consulting, focused on service design, UX design, and working with a lot of public services. Here's me on the left there on a project where one of my roles was designing a training experience for over 1,000 police officers in how to use social media for their local community. I had no idea what I was doing there, lots of things to work out, and just what started as an initial idea turned into this big project. Had loads of other kinds of experiences like this where I didn't really know what I was doing at the start, but kind of somehow worked it out. In the middle there is, yeah, like me in my element, I guess. Actually, on one of the many GB sprints that I did at Bunch, my previous work, and where we were trying to work out how we would grow the business, which was always pretty challenging. And on the right is just, me also in my element in nature, and sort of applies to what I'm working on now, which is transitioning my career into sustainability, climate justice, and hopefully using a lot of these design tools that I've learned in doing that. And now I see probably I want to be using some of these tools in my own life as well. Before this, I actually asked a bunch of people what they thought designing an ambiguity is. And these are some of the things that came up. So exciting, uncertainty, opportunity, interpretation, multidisciplinary. Someone's put unmotivating, unclear requirements, unsure, vague. So a lot of occasional migraine, not knowing what the fuck is going on. So kind of mixed response there. So I did a bit of digging and finding out what others also had to say about what designing an ambiguity is. There's a really good piece by Ben Holiday who describes it as not having the answers before you start, taking intuitive leaps, being bold enough to have strong opinions while actively working to prove yourself wrong, and holding ideas that might be in tension with how the world and existing models work. I would define it simply as when there are multiple paths forward and not a single right path, and making decisions when you don't have all of the answers. Also, this guy, Pedro Canhena, asks, is it a designer's job to remove ambiguity, live with it, use it as an advantage? And for me personally, I think it's a bit of all of it, depending on where you are in the process, what the constraints are, but ultimately I think it's a designer's job to help people make informed decisions despite the ambiguity. So, who actually likes it? Again, pretty mixed response. Some people love it, almost equally people hate it, and obviously typical designer response, it depends. For me also, I kind of raise my hand here. It's one of the most enjoyable parts about design, I think, and what makes it fun. Oftentimes when I'm maybe feeling a bit overwhelmed and maybe just having like loads of information, that's actually quite an interesting part of the journey in the design process, because usually that for me is a signal that I'm almost at a breakthrough and there's about to be sort of some eureka moments where all of the dots start to connect together. So if you can kind of push through that feeling of overwhelmed, it actually usually gets better after that, and it's really satisfying when you start to connect the dots. So now, in terms of what mindset do you think you need moving into, 4 mindsets that I think are worthwhile to pursue if you want to design well in ambiguity. Again, I asked some people beforehand. common things that came up: curiosity, openness, some other interesting ones here, like being playful, trusting yourself, accepting the chaos, willing to be proven wrong, leaving ego at the door. Lots of really good ideas in here. I've kind of summarized 4 mindsets that I think are key to actually dealing and navigating ambiguity. So here they are. First being childlike curiosity, thinking like a scientist, systems thinking, and growth mindset. So I'll go into each of these one by one. I recently went home actually for the holidays and got to spend a lot of time with my nieces and nephews, and they're really getting into making new things with Lego, and I felt like this was quite a interesting thing to watch because of course children have a lot of curiosity, and with Lego you can come at it with different approaches. You either start with building with your imagination, and just making whatever kind of comes to your mind, or you can also follow instructions. And I think for me, when I was trying to get involved, I remember feeling actually it's quite hard to just, or I have to overcome a few mental barriers to just start making stuff and like not rely on the instructions that are given. And I think that's like a process of unlearning what maybe you're taught as a child, or what comes naturally to you as a child that you forget about when you're younger. And when you come back to designing an ambiguity, I think that's the kind of mindset, this childlike curiosity, wonder, is something that you need to approach new projects with, because they actually enjoy that process. And I also observed my nieces and nephews like asking a lot of questions, and sometimes it's okay to take a position on them, but it's also really good to also ask questions back and like let them try and figure it out. And I also try to take this approach in designing an ambiguity and helping others be alongside me in that mindset of like encouraging them to ask the right questions as well, and not necessarily giving the answer straight away. Next one is actually a concept from Adam Grant, which I really liked in his recent book, Think Again. He talks about 4 modes of thinking. So preacher, here on the left, is when you're trying to persuade others into your way of thinking. A prosecutor mindset is when you're trying to prove someone else wrong. Politician is taking whatever position will please our audience. Obviously, Adam Grant has a bit of a somewhat negative view of politicians here. And then the last one, scientist, which he thinks is the best way to start thinking if you want to lead well-run businesses, find innovation, and I think also important for dealing with ambiguity. So he describes it as favoring humility over pride and curiosity over conviction. You know what you don't know, and you're eager to discover new things. And he also says, quite interestingly, you look for reasons why you might be wrong, not for just reasons why you might be right. And I think that's like where I think we can extend a little bit what we do as designers to actually build hypotheses, and you're seeking not just to validate them, but also to try and prove them wrong. Of course, you can't have scientific rigor on everything, but I think for the major assumptions, the major risks in the business, this is something that's super important, and what differentiates companies that are still thriving and companies that maybe didn't challenge their existing assumptions and then ended up kind of going downhill. He brings this story about BlackBerry and Apple and this science thinking actually being a big factor in what set them apart. The next one is actually systems thinking, and I must admit I'm a bit new to this, so I'm still learning this. But as Moss here describes, basically it's a way of seeing the world where everything is actually connected to each other, and you're not just focused on the individual elements, but more about the relationships between them. And when I think a common thing that we're taught in design is to make things simple, and Simple is sometimes good. Definitely simple is preferable over complicated, but complexity is something actually you need to embrace. And actually we do this already. When you're synthesizing research findings, you're already like looking for patterns and looking to connect the dots between different things. So you're already probably doing systems thinking. You just might not necessarily call it that. So I had a go at doing some of this myself. In my previous company, we did a lot of work in like company culture and in that sort of field. And it's pretty complex sort of system that grows a little bit organically. Businesses try to control it and try to look after it, but in the end, it's a lot of things that influence it that maybe are outside of your control. But I found it a really interesting exercise because once you start to map all of these things out and see how things are connected, you can think about where might you intervene, what might be, if you wanted to build design thinking in a culture, like where would you actually go to start? Would you start with a department? Would you start with a CEO or a founder and try to get like from a top-down perspective? There's lots of different approaches, and then you can start to evaluate where you might have the most leverage. But also by mapping it out, you can actually then define your boundaries. So there's some things in this map which probably you don't want to focus on because you don't have too much control, like the economy or the government or legislation, investors maybe somewhat. So actually Leila Akoroglu, who's pretty expert in this topic, she kind of calls it when you're learning to swim, you don't jump straight into the ocean. You first learn to swim in a pool, and then as you start to get more comfortable, you move into like bigger expanses of water. And I think that's the same with systems thinking. If you do feel overwhelmed, you can start small and then start to branch out. And with dealing with ambiguity, I think even just the process of being able to map these things out starts to reduce the feeling of not knowing what everything is, and like you can start to work out which areas you can delve into more. The last mindset, I think, is having a growth mindset. And so growth mindset as opposed to fixed mindset. And having a growth mindset means if you don't have the skills right now, or if you don't have the knowledge right now, you don't have the knowledge yet, or you don't have the skills yet. And that's kind of the belief. You think that you're able to learn, and it's not that you're born with a certain talent, but rather you're able to find things out through continuous practice and knowledge seeking. And I think this is the same case in designing an ambiguity. What will really help you is that having that mindset that you're, despite being a bit lost, you have the confidence, and you can also build confidence in your team that there are a lot of unknown right now, but you kind of have a process to find them out. And as long as you're making progress, that's like the main thing you should be looking for. And yeah, especially in a startup, which I was working in for 3 years, I think designers often can be a little bit skeptical because they're very focused on problems. But sometimes you do have to take the leap of faith and still go along with things when you don't have all the answers. So I think you need to dare to imagine. So those are the 4 mindsets. Now I think worth talking about some tactics for designing an ambiguity. So now you kind of have an understanding of how to think and how that will help you move forward. I wanted to get into some tools as well that you can use, and tools that I've used myself and that have helped me in these different contexts. So also asked a group of people beforehand what are some of the tactics they use for designing an ambiguity. So of course a major one came up as research. Of course this is kind of like, bread and butter for designers, and came up a lot. Mapping, asking questions, prioritizing, job stories, participatory design, user testing, ignore inconsequential, speaking to sales teams. So a lot of interesting ideas there. a lot around collaboration and like asking questions. So that's pretty cool. Wanted to go through actually 8 tools that I've used before, so I'll go through them quite quickly. But just for a bit of context, I'll be referring to my previous experience at Bunch quite a lot to give you some real life examples of how it works in practice. So just so you understand that, Bunch was my previous work. It's a startup whose mission has always been to help teams collaborate better. And in the 3 years I was working there, saw many different attempts to achieve this mission. The latest product, which is going pretty strong now, is this AI leadership coach. It's an app that gives you 2-minute leadership tips for different workplace scenarios, from designing inclusive meetings to managing up or one-on-one templates. And it's also personalized to your specific context. So I was kind of responsible for the kind of UX design, as well as more recently in the content side of things. So into the tools. First one is advocating for contextual research. So you kind of have to be like this guy, kind of like a fly in the wall a lot of the time. And you'll probably be experienced with doing interviews, doing kind of more of these one-on-one sessions, speaking to users, and that's great. But I think one of the things that is a bit underrated, and for me has provided a lot of value, is this contextual research. So why it's important is because when you're in the early stages and where lots of things are ambiguous, you don't necessarily know what to ask. The people you're interviewing might also not know exactly what you're interested in hearing. And when there are a lot of unknown unknowns, it's a good way of surfacing some of those things that will come through observation. So at the start of this kind of design early discovery phase with Bunch, before we had any kind of product, we just had this overall problem area. I actually shadowed our CTO, who was at the time pretty relevant for a typical like target user. He was like an early-ish leader, quite just learning the ropes and like managing a team of four people at the time. And yeah, I actually went over to his house, followed him on his commute home, stayed overnight, watched him and his partner chat over dinner, watched him cook, watched videos while he was doing it, also went along with his commute in the morning. This was, of course, pre-pandemic times when commutes were still a pretty big thing, and also observed him at work. So these are just a few images of some of the things I noticed. And yeah, discovered a lot of interesting things, like all of the different idle moments in his day where he consumed content in various formats as well. Like when he was cooking, he might be listening or watching stuff, whereas when he was on the commute, he'd often be listening while he was playing a Switch to an audiobook, for example. And on the right there is some notes he made from this book that he actually then applied with a team member later on from a book that he was reading. And some of these things like directly led into sort of feature ideas and things in the app, like we had the ability to save mental models tips for later, because we knew things you might find inspiring at the time, but then there'd be a situation later on where you actually then apply it. And these two things often don't happen at the same time. Likewise, with his discussions with his partner about work, a lot of people might not have access to this kind of sparring partner or sounding board. And that's one of the reasons why we built this community around the product as well, because people need that network to be able to talk about what's going on. So yeah, I would definitely advocate for a lot of this kind of process. Even if you can just do one observational study is like already going to give you tons of insights that you wouldn't even think about beforehand. The next one is making time for proper synthesis, and synthesis also visual synthesis I really make a strong point for. Um, so this is quite a hard thing to get buy-in for sometimes. But I really think you need to make time for it, because if you stay at the sort of analysis level, you're not going to be able to join the dots and use that kind of systems thinking that I talked about earlier. And that might keep things in that ambiguous or confusing space when you're just doing the kind of analysis, like debriefs after each interview, that kind of stuff. You do need to make time to look for patterns across all of that as well. So a few examples that I've done this from that same like day in the life study with the CTO, and a few other people through interviews as well, mapped out like all of the different trigger points in his day where there might be opportunities where he's looking at content, and mapped out the opportunities as well. And this was a sort of synthesis of multiple data points from that session, other sessions, interviews as well, where we kind of asked people to talk about their average day, and then synthesized it here. And that was very important again for like defining when people might be using the app, what time might we notify them, in which context they might be using it, and making it sort of visual helped people to understand where were the main opportunity points, which tended to be in the morning actually. I would have loved to actually take this into like a storyboard as well, which I think would be the next level. Also, we did some career journey mapping as well. So this was more focused around like the target market as well. Like when in a person's career are they typically like to use this kind of product that we were thinking about. And did a few deep dive interviews with people. And as we did the interviews, started mapping out the journey so they could fill in the gaps. They could already see it in front of the screen, and we were kind of co-creating. And by the end of the process, we looked at all of the journey maps we'd created and started to look for patterns as well. And that was a big factor in working out where in people's career are they most likely to use it. And then we could specifically position the product towards them. When they're in these phases of uncertainty, maybe it's like a new job, they're getting promoted, or like really early management where they haven't got any training at all. So my advice in actually doing this, making time for it, is just to start, maybe visualize something on one piece of data, and then once people see it, it's much more memorable. It gets people excited than just a long PowerPoint presentation, and then you can start bringing in data from other places and keep adding to it, and it can be sort of this living document. The next tool, number 3, is about generating assumptions as a team. So maybe the Donald Trump approach isn't quite the right one, but it is definitely important to call out when things are assumed and when people are making assumptions, and when you've got more confidence in an idea. And I think this is one tactic to get people into this like childlike scientist mindset, focusing on, okay, we're running experiments, we're basing things on assumptions, how confident are we in these assumptions, and like framing everything around that and having this sense of humility. And once you start talking about things in assumptions and how confident you are in them, then it helps you navigate the ambiguity, because you can discuss as a team, okay, this thing we actually have a lot of evidence for, we've got a lot of confidence for, that's okay, we can kind of be okay with that, we can move on. But there's other stuff where we actually don't know much about, and we're basing a lot of our thinking around this. So actually, to help you process all of these assumptions that are flying around, you can actually start to write them all down and prioritize them. So I did a workshop with Bunch, who actually taught me most of this. I learned it from them rather than me teaching them. They constantly, as a team, reviewed their assumptions about the business and thought about it like, if we're wrong about this, like, our business might fail. And that gave them a roadmap to actually start prioritizing and say, okay, these are the things that are the riskiest things in our business, and we don't have much confidence in them. So we can start to then build experiments to help either say that assumption is actually true, or we need to think a bit differently about this. So, for example, one assumption we had was that emerging leaders were emotionally aware and not oblivious to people issues, because that was like important, because then they would actually seek out help from another source and they wouldn't just keep going with their current process. So we defined how to test this. We looked at Google keyword analysis to see what people might be searching for, like themselves, and also interview questions to see like how sort of top of mind was it, and how, if they had examples where they had actually sought outside help for people issues that they had. And the kind of outcome from those different testing methods was a bit mixed, actually. And some problems people were aware of, but usually when it starts blowing up and it's like very obvious and you can observe it. But a lot of the kind of symptoms already start earlier. So that kind of led to this inspiration use case where we recommend content for them and it sort of already challenges like existing mental models that they have. So yeah, that's like also a great thing, because you can then say there's a lot of things that we are assuming, but actually they're low risk and we don't need to worry about them. And you can then like park that and move forward with only the things that are like risky. Now here's a bit of a different one, something I definitely learned at Bunch, and I think would hope other people learn this too, because we would have saved a lot of time if we'd have known about this before. And this is about stating your purpose and constraints, or your vision, thinking about what you want to do and what you don't want to do. So went through quite a journey with this with Bunch, actually. When I first started, they were working on a kind of team alignment tool, and at that time they weren't really comfortable with how well it was going, wanted to pivot a little bit, had this overall mission of helping teams work together better, but started to see that the main use case was for hiring. And this psychological assessment that you would do could also predict how well someone might fit in a team and what kind of the major sources of conflict would be. And like most of the users started using it for hiring. And because we weren't super happy with how much traction this product were getting, we pivoted and we focused like specifically on hiring and followed where the behavior was kind of leading us. And that led us to a pretty deep dive into hiring, worked out that sourcing candidates was the most painful part of that process, and then built this Chrome extension on LinkedIn that used the same sort of psychological parts, but to help find out at that sourcing stage what people might be the right fit for the company. At that point, then LinkedIn didn't really like it, and also the founder wasn't super passionate about hiring. So we then kind of went back a little bit to our roots and back towards team development again, very much influenced by our investors at that stage. And so we built this culture analytics program that allowed leaders to actually analyze culture based on like Slack communication. Super difficult product to work with, lots of big data issues, but also again sort of taking us a little bit away from this currently abstract vision, but people could feel it intuitively. It wasn't really focused on the end user, which was everyday managers. It was towards HR leaders and CEOs. And again, that made the founder feel like, not really sure if I can get out of bed every day to work on this. And after like the third pivot, at that time, our head of growth actually did like pretty hardcore interview with the founder to work out like why did she start the business in the first place, because none of us really wanted to keep pivoting until we eventually ran out of money. So we really needed to understand like why she started, what was her original purpose. And originally it was like starting as a coach, helping startup teams, individuals, learn how to do their job and manage teams better. And she had delivered value at that stage, but she couldn't scale it with just herself, and she was always frustrated with that. And so sought to kind of productize this. And that focus on coaching and individuals led us to this AI leadership coach. And yeah, it's something that's still going pretty strong now. And I would be super surprised if they pivoted again. But having a strong purpose is, like, I think, as important as just following the market. You need to have a bit of a mix of both, I think. And so at that stage, we also said what we're not going to build. And we weren't going to build a one-on-one tool. We weren't going to build a coaching marketplace. So those kind of things we already ruled out early on, which helped us focus a bit more. And that was the vision at the time, which definitely helped kind of align where the product might head. Number 5, mapping opportunities. Back in the day here with Theresa May. Interestingly, the person who I'm going to talk about, also called Theresa, she has this great topic, great tool called the Opportunity Solution Tree. And you can have a look at her talk. Teresa Torres has a product talk on this and explains it in a lot of detail. But overall, you start with this desired outcome, and in our case, helping managers to become better leaders. And then you look at all of the different opportunities that are kind of promising to help deliver that outcome. And you work your way down, finding solutions that actually relate to that opportunity, and then experiments that help you test those solutions and whether they actually help you deliver that desired outcome that you're setting out to deliver. And I think this is really useful because in the sort of ambiguous phase, people don't really like it. That's where they jump straight to solutions because that feels comfortable. Being in the problem space is pretty uncomfortable for most people. And I think if there was just a little bit more time spent on evaluating all of the different opportunities, you would end up like saving a lot of time. And this is what Teresa Torres like talks about, having some sort of process to evaluate the opportunities in front of you. And especially there's so many ways to deliver that desired outcome. It kind of gives you a framework that helps you evaluate which ones you think have the most likelihood to deliver that outcome. And so, yeah, you can compare and contrast. In this case, this was one of the first, this is the first version that we did. And like the desired outcome was that managers would use our product weekly to improve their leadership behavior. And then there's so many ways we could deliver that. And we started then experimenting with different options, different opportunities in parallel. And one of those ended up being the leadership coach, or the starting point of the leadership coach that you can use today. Then number 6, looking for analogous experience. So a lot of the times, yeah, you can do all of these opportunities, but I think you need to start visualizing what that actually might look like and painting a picture of what it could be. And a really good tool for doing this when you just have kind of this blank slate. Okay, we're going to do this like leadership coach, but what actually is that? So you can look at different experiences that kind of mimic what you're trying to achieve. And in the GV sprint structure, actually, they have this small part called lightning demos, where you're looking at parallel experiences and taking out what are the best parts, what works, what maybe you wouldn't want to mimic. And also it's like not looking only at competitors, because you don't want to necessarily just copy your competitors. You're looking for differentiation. So in this phase, you can start to look at other parallels. So in our case at Bunch, we looked at Clio, which was this chat-based financial assistant that you could ask it questions. It would kind of roast you on your finances. Really cool tool. And it was kind of mimicking this personal coaching experience, but in a different context of finance. Also the Freeletics personal trainer. Also, we borrowed a lot of stuff from that actually, because in the end, like we saw leadership as this like continuous behavior habit that you wanted to do and learn how to get better. And in the same way with Freeletics, where you're training every day and you have this coach kind of supporting you, we also kind of borrowed a lot of like the same parallels for leadership coaching. And then the last one was Ada Health, or one of the other ones, main ones, and that was more of a diagnosis tool. So this was helping you to diagnose maybe what health issues you might have. And that was another kind of experience that we looked at, because in some cases, leaders they knew they had some problems, but they didn't quite know how to get to the root cause. So we kind of looked into this healthcare thing, like Ada Health have done a really good job of helping you find what you might be dealing with just by asking a lot of questions. And so just having these, like we could borrow some stuff and start to sketch out what the app might look like. Okay, number 7, almost there. Using concierge prototypes. So a concierge prototype is basically as close to your real service as you can get away with. So the users that might be testing it wouldn't necessarily know that this isn't your real product. But a lot of it is using like sort of hacky tools, no code things that you can do really quickly without having to like spend a load of time building a complicated prototype. So in the early versions of Bunch, we knew that it was kind of like we needed to create this like personal coaching experience at scale. And initially we thought it could be a chat tool. So we started on WhatsApp and iMessage actually, and gathered a group of about 80 people who we started messaging every week. And they gave us their challenges and we kind of delivered some answers to them as a coach. And each week we would come back with new recommendations based on what their challenges were. And then we could start to see, okay, how can we actually productize some of this? So we were testing different things, and it gave us a really good canvas to test things really quickly. Like every week we were doing a new experiment, at least one, maybe more. So we tested a bunch of different things, like what kind of format of the content will we deliver? Was it audio? Was it video? Was it text-based, conversational? What kind of content would it be? Would it be directly focused on people's personal challenges? Could we actually do that at scale versus like more generic content? We tested different topics, like what were the kind of trends that people are looking for? Things like leadership profiles and setting goals, progress tracking. We tested some quizzes. But overall, what this really helped do is when you're at this stage and you don't quite know, like you do some interviews, you kind of can see, okay, people are already telling me they behave in a similar way. So when I build this product, I can assume they're gonna also like adopt it and use it because they're doing the same thing, but you don't really know, you're guessing still. And with concierge prototypes, because you actually can track whether they actually engage with the product, whether they actually respond to things, how long they actually stay with your service, you can really test the real numbers and have lots more confidence that your product is actually going to be adopted. So we were measuring engagement and retention over time with this WhatsApp coach and could see which experiments actually caused an uplift in engagement and what didn't really work. So yeah, definitely a really good tool to help you with that ambiguous stage where you're like, we think it might work. Do we really want to invest like a whole dev team into building this? And this can be the last stage where you can actually get some real measurable data to give you that confidence. And in the end, last one, when you're dealing with ambiguity, you in the end won't have all of the data. You'll never have full evidence for any of your decisions, really, and that's like a reality you have to come to terms with. And in the end, you're making bets. And one thing I would often say actually at Bunch, which kind of brought people into the same sort of mindset, is if I was to make a bet, I would choose X, or I would go with this option. And it kind of gives a sense of humility, like you're kind of guessing, you're betting, but you can also follow up to say why. People might ask you why. And then others seem to follow and say, okay, like actually I agree with you, I would also make the same bet. Or they might challenge you and say, actually I'd bet on this. And it starts to breed a conversation around like why people are confident in certain ideas. And by the end, you can make a decision. And this is kind of concept from Annie Duke, who was formerly a professional poker player and then wrote this book, Thinking in Bets. And she says, forcing ourselves to express how sure we are of our beliefs brings into plain sight the probabilistic nature of those beliefs. That what we believe is almost never 100% or 0% accurate, but somewhere in between. And so this kind of cuts through. When you're like a bit dealing with this analysis paralysis and can't make a decision, use bets to kind of, okay, let's just do it. We know we're taking a risk, but we're 60% confidence that this is likely to happen, and it helps you kind of make that decision. And with the really risky ones, you can always come up with tactics to reverse that decision if you weren't quite right about it to begin with. So that's it. Hopefully you followed along. So here's just a reminder of the 4 mindsets and the different tools that I covered. And I'm writing up a blog post as well, so you can have a look at that, which will go into some of the details as well. But thanks so much for joining and listening along. I hope that really helped. And I hope you start to see a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, and you can work your way through, navigate through ambiguity with these different mindsets, these different tools. Thanks a lot.